One of the most important things that C15 does is it serves as an armor that helps to stabilize our cell membranes. Really important because it prevents them from breaking down, which is a primary cause of aging and acceleration of chronic diseases. Then there's this really unique sign that C15 deficiency leaves behind, and that's iron. So there's actually iron overload in the liver that you can physically see in the tissues. That then causes insulin resistance. I don't think there's a part of the body that's untouched or unaffected by insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. A clinical trial that was done in Singapore with C15 supplementation showed it actually helped to make a beneficial microbe called Bifidobacterium adolescentis. That doesn't make C15, but interestingly, C15 helps Bifidobacterium adolescentis to grow, which is a really interesting microbe, not only because it helps with balancing metabolism, but in and of itself has helped to extend longevity in multiple species.
Dr. Steph, what is C15? And walk me through the process of what happens in the body if we don't get enough of it.
Absolutely. So C15 is an odd chain saturated fatty acid. More importantly, Jesse, is that C15 is the first essential fatty acid to be discovered in over 90 years since omega-3 and omega-6. So a really big discovery and lots to unpack with regard to how and why this saturated fat is essential.
Well, before we get into deficiency and going down that stream as I initially brought up, let's talk about how you discovered it. You mentioned this 90-year period since the other omegas. This isn't in omega specifically, but it's in that same realm of being essential. How was it discovered?
Right. So accidentally is the short answer. The longer answer is I'm a veterinary epidemiologist, and I was working for the World Health Organization and was recruited by the Navy actually about 20 years ago to help continually improve the health and wellness of Navy dolphins, Jess, which was, again, a surprise because, as some people know, I don't even know how to swim. So ended up working at the Navy, caring for Navy dolphins. And long story short, these dolphins get such great care, live in the open ocean of San Diego Bay. They live substantially longer than dolphins in the wild. And so that allowed us to see that within the Navy population, understanding why some dolphins, even within that population, aged better, actually aged slower than other Navy dolphins. And we were able to find out what were the best predictors of dolphins that don't develop high cholesterol, don't develop chronic inflammation, don't develop Alzheimer's disease. And we were able to use an advanced technology called metabolomics. We thought it'd be omega-3s for sure. And we were proven wrong that the best predictor of the healthiest aging dolphins was C15. So a saturated fat I've never heard of became our top contender and now a leading longevity nutrient.
All right. So C15, specifically what foods in a dolphin's diet would that come from? And then humans.
So for the dolphins, it's fish. And what was important was specific types of fish, that not all fish have C15. It's not even just different amounts of C15. There's some fish that have no C15 in it. And so what happened was the Navy dolphins had moved to a lower fat diet, not unlike ourselves, over the past 50 years. And the Navy dolphins had moved to a diet that had less C15 in it. They do have some choices. They have about 5 different types of fish they get to choose from. And so what was differentiating the dolphins within the population was that some of the dolphins were choosing the higher fat, higher C15 fish. And maybe, I don't know, maybe they just knew that those were the right fish to help them age slower. So that's for dolphins. For us, our primary source of C15 is from dairy fat. So it's whole dairy fat, ideally grass-fed. And we can chat more about what influences C15 content in dairy fat.
All right, we'll come back to the food piece, but let's get into C15 in the body and talk about somebody who's not getting enough, and then we'll go through that cascade and get into the physiology.
Absolutely. So C15 is present in our body as an essential fatty acid. our body requires certain levels of C15. So we have to have this certain amount of C15 in our body in order to maintain our baseline physiologic health. And if we don't have enough, Jess, that's what we get to, this deficiency syndrome, right? So when you think about an essential fatty acid, it's like a vitamin. And just like we know that there's vitamin C deficiency is scurvy and vitamin D deficiency is rickets. So if a nutrient is truly essential, if we don't have enough of it, we're going to develop a disease due to a lack of it. So cellular fragility syndrome, which is a C15 deficiency syndrome, we published in Metabolites a couple of months ago. And it's actually been a culmination of over 10 years of work. And what we now know is that C15 plays a core role in stabilizing our cell membrane. So all it does is serve as, I shouldn't say all it does. One of the most important things that C15 does is it serves as an armor that helps to stabilize our cell membranes. Such a simple task, but really heavy, really important because it keeps our cells stable and it prevents them from breaking down, which is a primary cause of aging and acceleration of chronic diseases. So simple task, really important one.
And for somebody that's not getting enough of this molecule, what ends up filling in that space in the cell membrane?
That's a great question. So what happens is that if we don't have enough of C15, we are what we eat. So it actually will get filled in by other fats in our diet. And it ends up that C15 is really this Goldilocks fat that is not only a stabilizer as far as a saturated fat, but it also has anti-inflammatory properties. It helps to bind to things like activate AMPK, which is great for our metabolism. It inhibits mTOR, which is feeds into the helping to support longevity. So if C15 isn't there, there are going to be two other fats that are going to take its place. One is going to be an even chain saturated fatty acid like C16 or C14, right, with an even number of carbons in it. And those saturated fats are the opposite. They're pro-inflammatory. So while they might be stable fats, they're going to incite inflammation. Or it's going to get replaced with an unsaturated fatty acid, which we're typically, think of those as healthy fats. But the weakness of unsaturated fats is they have these double bonds in their structures that can get attacked by oxygen. That feeds lipid peroxidation and makes our cells weaker. So it really is, C15 is this really unique Goldilocks fat that, like you said, if it's not in there, other fats are going to go in and replace it.
In that latter example, talking about polyunsaturated, this sounds a lot like what a lot of people in our world are talking about with seed oils or vegetable oils, these unstable fats getting incorporated within the cell membranes and then being less stable than C15 or some of these other higher quality fats.
Yeah, that is exactly it. And in fact, it's so important that back in 2012, there were there was a team of scientists at Columbia University who discovered an entirely new way that our cells were dying. So when you go to cell biology class, right, we learned there are 3 ways that our cells die. They found a 4th. And it was a giant discovery that really kind of went, I guess it just wasn't sexy enough to make the headlines. But now we're realizing the importance of this. This method of cell death is called phoroptosis. And the way they describe it is that the fats in the cell membrane are less stable. The cell starts becoming more fragile. It undergoes lipid peroxidation, combines with this iron that shouldn't be in there, results in massive reactive oxygen species, takes out our mitochondria, and the cell dies. It's a very unique way our cells are dying. There have been over 10,000 papers published on phoroptosis since its publication in 2012. We now understand it's accelerating our aging. It increases the onset of type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and heart disease. What we're seeing in younger and younger people, what was left unanswered is what's causing phoroptosis. And now our paper that we came out with is showing that deficiencies in C15 paired with an increase in these polyunsaturated fatty acids are leading to this whole new form of cell death.
You brought the mitochondria in. And when I think of the mitochondria, I think of their membrane, which is very like the cell itself. And you mentioned the fact that when this happens, the mitochondria are destroyed in the process. Along the way, as these bad fats are getting incorporated in cell membranes, does the mitochondria have the same thing happen on a micro level too?
It's a great question. And the answer is yes. So, as anything that involves fatty acids, even when we look at mitochondria's role, one of the key roles of mitochondria, they have their own cell membrane, so that gets impacted. But then mitochondria are supposed to use fatty acids to then convert that into energy. And so this whole system gets torn apart by this imbalance of healthy versus I should say susceptible versus sturdy, saturated and unsaturated fats, with C15 being in this really unique position of being anti-inflammatory and stable against lipid peroxidation. Essential, an essential fatty acid.
We talked about when you don't have enough of it, the issues that can arise. Flipping that the other way, somebody that's listening today and they get excited about their dairy, their fatty fish, a supplement like you've created, and they start taking in tons of C15, can we throw the balance off the other way as well?
It's a good question. We haven't seen that happen. So one of the big tests would be dairy fat, for example. So understanding that dairy fat is, our primary source of C15, that there have been no associations, for example, of higher C15 levels, which is routinely measured, and especially in dairy studies, because for the past, 25, 30 years, dairy fat is such a reliable source of our C15, Jess, that C15 has been used as a biomarker of how much dairy fat we eat. And there have been no studies to date showing that higher C15 levels in our body are associated with worse health. In fact, the higher the C15 we go thus far, the healthier we become. The lower risk of developing heart disease, for example, that there's a linear association that doesn't kind of go back up. So that probably means our body's going to use as much C15 as it needs. And anything beyond that, which I don't know if we know what that is yet, that it must pass on and not, for example, make cells too rigid.
All right, I'm going to try and recap the story so far. We don't have enough C15. Cells become fragile. Then that leads to ferroptosis, ROS, and lipid peroxidation. Let's take the story even further and involve the liver, and then we'll go from there.
Oh, you're so smart. So the liver, right? So 1980 was the first, reports by Mayo Clinic of the strange disease that at that time they called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or NASH. And then since then, and those were about 20 cases, I think they reported. You fast forward to today, and now I think we're up to 38% of people globally are estimated to have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is now going through a rebranding of being called MASLD. But anyway, a fatty liver disease shows up kind of out of nowhere, and I'm trying to understand what's happening with the liver. That disease, because it has such a high prevalence, is now driving subsequent issues with regard to our metabolism, with heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. So just to kind of set the stage of the importance of the liver these days. When all of these things happen that you just lined out really well, what happens in the liver is you have, like you said, you have ROS, you have lipid peroxidation, and then there's this really unique sign that C15 deficiency leaves behind, and that's iron. So there's actually iron overload in the liver that you can physically see in the tissues. The dolphins were developing this exact same condition. And that then leads to and causes insulin resistance, and as well as a slew of other things, increased cholesterol production by the liver, and the whole family that you see around metabolic syndrome that then feeds out into all of these other. I don't think there's a part of the body that's untouched or unaffected by insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. So it all starts, just like where you're getting to, all starts at the liver. with this kind of ferroptosis in fragile cells.
Well, let's get into physiology in the liver. You mentioned the fact that it's building up with iron. What's happening there on a cellular level?
Right. So iron, we always think of iron being good, and we think about iron deficiency. We've got to take more iron to fix iron deficiency and anemia. What's now happening for a lot of people is the opposite. We're getting these fragile, specifically red blood cells. They get engulfed by cells within the liver called macrophages or Kupffer cells. They engulf these fragile red blood cells, and the corpses that are left behind from these red blood cells is iron. And if you continue to have iron deposited in your liver and it accumulates over time, then what happens is you basically have a toxic metal that is now inciting inflammation, cell death, and this ferroptosis cycle becomes very aggressive. And then that iron overload, then along with the reactive oxygen species and the lipid peroxidation, that spills over from the liver, Jess, and that then starts seeding different organs, our brain, our heart. And so there's a lot of papers that have been showing more and more people developing more aggressive aging associated diseases like Alzheimer's, like heart disease, like fatty liver disease, that's tied to this iron deposition in the tissues.
Okay, so the way I understand the liver piece, because these red blood cells, along with other cells in the body, have this dysfunction of the membrane, the macrophages in the liver notice these cells aren't performing or looking normal. They destroy them. Red blood cells have heme in them, iron, and then that builds up and causes a toxic problem in the liver.
That's right. I'm giving you a high five right now. Nerd out, a fellow nerd. I love it.
Okay, well, let's take the story even further. So the liver gets all toxified and clogged up. Eventually, this spills over into the body and starts impacting the spleen.
Yeah, it goes spleen, it goes pancreatic. And so that's where, with regard to different effects with regard to red blood cell production, red blood cell stability, with regard to our immune responses, and then in the pancreas of affecting our beta cells and insulin, basically being able to respond efficiently to glucose and insulin.
Sorry, I meant pancreas. I said spleen.
Gotcha.
Is the spleen
I was with you.
Okay? Is the spleen affected eventually as well?
Spleen, yeah. So spleen can also get iron deposition, and but yeah, the biggest story with regard to insulin resistance is absolutely in the pancreas.
Okay, so trying to cross bridge this over to our classical story of insulin resistance, we've now talked about the problems in the liver, problems in the pancreas. With insulin resistance, obviously insulin's made in the pancreas and now it's being damaged due to everything we've been talking about. Is both the liver and the pancreas, the issues happening there, the connection to insulin resistance?
It is, yeah. And what's proof of that is that when you, like, for example, we were seeing evidence of insulin resistance showing up in the dolphins that had this cellular fragility syndrome. They had, one of the first things we saw was iron deposition in their liver paired with metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. And when we removed the iron, when we treated the iron overload component, which the main way that you treat it in dolphins and in people, it's bloodletting. So you got to take off blood. It's phlebotomy, and when you remove the blood, it pulls the iron from the liver, and the insulin resistance resolved completely. So it does show that with regard to this whole pathophysiology behind what's happening, that it does appear that a major player is this iron deposition in the tissues, and that when you remove that iron, the insulin resistance resolves. The problem is just by taking off the blood, you're not fixing the actual problem, right? Which is these fragile red blood cells due to C15 deficiency. So once we figured out, what's the actually underlying mechanism of this, and we were able to get higher C15 back into these dolphins' diets, then we saw it really resolve from not just a remove the iron, because then the iron just started depositing again until we fixed the C15 issue.
In relation to insulin resistance, how much of it would you say is due to the fact that the pancreas is affected and insulin being made there becomes hindered?
I think it's an important role of it. I think we're still trying to understand with regard to this primary role of the liver versus and its association with the pancreas. So we're still learning. The liver became such a focus area because of from the dolphins we were seeing elevated liver enzymes and then fatty liver disease, which then quickly all of our attention went to what dolphins are getting fatty liver disease at the same time this is rising in people. And a lot of our focus really centered around the liver and fixing the problem. But Jesse, it's a great point with regard to how much of this, that while our focus was on restoring healthy livers, we're also being able to have the effect of getting a healthy pancreas back as well.
And the reason that piece is so interesting for me is because classic insulin resistance over, say, 10, 20 years, the body's going to make more and more insulin to deal with that elevated blood glucose. And in this case, if the pancreas is being destroyed or impacted in a negative way and making less insulin, it's a paradox there. And I'm trying to piece it together with what we know about insulin resistance and then bringing this in.
That's right. That to your point, that what we're seeing in the dolphins was not basically a primary takedown or an overarching takedown of the pancreas. That it's just more of understanding how is fatty liver disease tied to insulin resistance, to metabolic syndrome, the same combination of ingredients that we saw in the dolphins that we're seeing in people. And so figuring out the order of events, I think we're still trying to figure out. But we were definitely seeing in the dolphins that classic insulin resistance picture, despite not having glucose in their diet to be able to do that challenge, but that they had a hyperinsulinemia, they had a hypoferritinemia, which was due to that high iron deposits in the tissue. And then we were then able to see a lot of these things get fixed. The part that the dolphins were missing was a hyperglycemia, just because they don't have carbohydrates in their diet. And that wasn't like a first line response of that for them to metabolic syndrome.
Okay, I just got clarification there on a piece. I had thought it was the other way, where the dolphins are actually making more insulin. I had assumed, I guess, when the pancreas was impacted by all this, that it would make less insulin, but insulin in the body went up with the dolphins.
It did.
Got it.
Yep, that's a good point. So therefore, we just figured this out together. So the pancreas not being the primary driver for an issue with regard to glucose handling and having less insulin available, they were overcompensating.
So for somebody, whether it be human or a dolphin, continuing on this journey of not having enough C15 and continues out of, not having the proper C15 in the diet and not knowing what we're talking about today, would the story continue? Would further damage start escalating to other areas of the body?
Yeah. So and the evidence that we've seen thus far is with regard to, it's more that once it seeds these critical organs, right? So, and starting with the liver, but also with the heart, and we're just starting to understand iron deposition in the brain, then the best way to think about it is it's a form of accelerated aging, right? And that all goes back to phoroptosis, right? The core of what C15 is causing is this method of cell death, which it creates more fragile cells, which is what happens when we age. And it's a reason why we age. The problem is that it's happening in kids and 30-year-olds and 50-year-olds far before that should be happening later in life. So the way it's playing out is that we're seeing body-wide compromise in the integrity of our cells. Our cells are breaking down faster. That's leading to accelerated aging on all fronts. And how we're seeing that play out in the real world is not only the emergence of diseases that didn't even exist before, like fatty liver disease, but the much more aggressive forms of metabolic related diseases at earlier and earlier ages. And we know population-wide our C15 levels are going down as our intake of whole dairy fat and C15 sources have gone down. So urgency with regard to how this is playing out in the real world, but hope, because the nice thing about a nutritional deficiency is that it's fixable. So that's why Jeff Schwimmer, who's a leading pediatric gastroenterologist, he's one of the leaders in fatty liver disease in kids, opened the first fatty liver disease clinic for kids in the world. Jeff read our paper about fatty liver disease in dolphins 10 years ago, and he reached out and he's like, what? He's like, how are dolphins getting this? They don't eat sugar. And that's when we've worked together for the past 10 years. He just published a clinical trial using C15 supplementation in young adults with fatty liver disease, and indeed showed that within 12 weeks, we saw evidence of stronger red blood cells, but most importantly, lowered liver enzymes. So it's all feeding the studies supporting that not only do C15 deficiencies accelerate diseases, but it may in fact be one of the underlying drivers for why fatty liver disease showed up in the first place.
Let's talk more about that piece of bringing C15 back in. We know it's fixable, at least to some degree, but if somebody's been pushing it for a long period of time, not getting enough C15, and they've gone through a lot of the physiology we've talked about to this point, do we know how reversible it is when there's damage to the pancreas, to the liver, and we've gotten into some pretty severe deficiency damage in the body? If somebody brings in dairy or a supplement like you've created, how far can we take that repair?
The hope is we can completely reverse the ongoing problem. So damage to tissues that can't get regenerated, then C15 doesn't do that. The C15 doesn't make cells that don't regenerate. C15 does help with regard to when we increase C15, our body is really good throughout our entire body of think of it as a dried sponge, right? And that C15 is the water that soon as you put that C15 into the system, our cell membranes readily absorb that C15 and take it on to help restore the function and the form that they're supposed to be. So in models, it effectively reverses the problem. But if you have liver cirrhosis or fibrosis, even though C15 has demonstrated antifibrotic activity, its primary role would not be like then it's going to go and make all the damage that's happened go away. There is some evidence that does help fix it. And most importantly, it gets our bodies back on track so that all the cells made going forward and that are present will then be able to gain their function back. It's one of those things that because it's a deficiency, restoring it really does help fix the problem.
One of the big challenges with insulin resistance classically, and I touched on this before, is the fact that it can take so long smoldering in the body before people know anything's going on. So when C15 deficiency, as we've talked about it, this negative physiology happening in the body, how does somebody know symptom-wise that what we've been talking about is happening?
Right. It's exactly like you described, Jesse. It's pretty insidious, right? So it's difficult to know what's happening because it's happening at the cellular level and it's happening slowly over time. So it's a big reason of why a lot of our education and first, why we publish everything in the peer-reviewed literature, all of our science so that we can reach the healthcare providers and the scientists that are working on the problem. That's how we got to Jeff Schwimmer, right? Dr. Schwimmer, to be able to do this work with kids with fatty liver disease. So what's going to be important is being able to work with healthcare providers to have a panel of knowing what to look for. So like, for example, in the dolphins, we weren't looking at a dolphin and saying, oh, it has a C15 deficiency. Even today, what we look for are biomarkers of the problem. First and foremost, we can measure C15 levels. And so that's always been around. Now doctors can actually care about what the levels say. So we know that we need about 0.2% of all fatty acids in our blood. Greater than that is what we need to not be deficient, which is great. And those tests are now readily available. So we can start with, do we have the right levels in our blood? And then with regard to what we care about, important markers like I'd mentioned, ferritin. Ferritin is a measurement of how much iron is present in our tissues. And that level will go up if you're developing iron overload. And that is an insidious process where it just keeps adding over decades, but you will see those ferritin levels go up. The dolphins had extraordinarily high ferritin levels, and that was a big tip for us. The other measurements that will likely come into the panel are things like lipid peroxidation, that if we can, understanding that this method of ferroptosis is happening, be able to measure lipid peroxidation. But then as it gets more into the disease state, you're going to start seeing lowered hemoglobin with regard to red blood cell indices, where it shows evidence that there's this biomarker called RDW, which is incredibly powerful in being able to recognize if you have a high RDW, red blood cell distribution width, this is suggestive of being part of this syndrome. So it's more like, it's one of those things where, when a doctor has, if you have 5 out of 7 of these on your routine test results, you may have C15 deficiency, but of course, getting the C15 levels is a pretty sure shot.
All right. So we have a test so we can check our blood. The number you mentioned there is 0.2. That's the threshold we want to at least make sure we're at to keep ourselves healthy. Is it different for humans and dolphins, or is it pretty similar?
Remarkably, it was pretty similar. We have different relative amounts of some types of fatty acids in our cell membranes, but it was pretty amazing, Jesse, going back to when we were finding all this out in humans and we were understanding the threshold values. When we went back to the dolphins, it was the same. And so specifically to the red blood cells, that we really do need that percentage of infrastructure in our cell membrane to keep them from becoming fragile. And red blood cells are such a great cell to look at that's representing our whole body, because we can very easily, red blood cells are very easy tests for doctors to be able to say all kinds of things about them. Are they more fragile? Do you have enough? In which way are they fragile? So it's a very powerful index of how we're doing.
Okay, coming back to the 0.2, that's the threshold. If that's good, what is the upper limit that we consider great or thriving?
Really good question. So there are some hints that more is better. It started in 2005 with A.J. Holbert. And so he came out with a theory called the cell membrane pacemaker theory of aging. And Holbert didn't focus on C15, but what he did show was that he looked at a bunch of different mammals, and he wanted to answer the question of, could cell membrane strength dictate the longevity of a mammalian species? And so he, in fact, showed that. He showed the more fragile the fatty acids in a cell membrane, the shorter that mammal lived. So it actually explained how a human and a dolphin and an elephant lives longer than a mouse. So that gets us back to your question, which is our question is, okay, can we push that evolutionary trick even further? And to say, if we can increase the C15 levels in our cell membranes, which we know makes our cells stronger, can that actually help an individual extend their longevity? And so data to date support that answer is yes, in part because it is slowing the onset of chronic diseases. So that alone will help us live longer, as long as you believe that, which I believe. If I can not get type 2 diabetes and heart disease and fatty liver disease, then I'm going to live longer. There's a hint in Sardinia, and I know the blue zones are undergoing some scrutiny these days, but they will survive for sure. from what I've been seeing on the back end here in the science world, that if you go to a place like Sardinia, where people live longer, and just look within that population, they have C15 levels which are 2 to 3 times higher than us, here in the United States. So in the US, the average person we're right at that edge of 0.2% of C15. In Sardinia, even older people, knowing that our C15 levels decline as we age, older people, we're talking people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and 100, they have 0.4 to 0.6% of C15 in there. So you're double to triple amount higher, which matches big studies from Harvard and other folks showing that once you reach that 0.4 to 0.6 level, you have the lowest risk of developing heart disease. Interestingly, in Sardinia, they have a relatively lower risk of heart disease compared to the rest of the world. So that is a long-winded way of getting to your answer, which is that there is support that by getting to this 0.4 to 0.6% of C15, that we can extend our longevity, which is relatively easy to do.
What's the highest number you've seen tested?
I have to say, I think I'm the second highest of results that we've seen. That we have a test. We partnered with Genova Diagnostics for an at-home test for C15, and so when we have seen results from that test, it's been around this like 0.6% is the highest that we've seen thus far. So not that we're gamifying it.
And where do you typically hover around?
So I'm at this, so 0.6, I should say 0.6 is the highest that's been reported, period. I shouldn't say via this test. I have a 0.46%, and the next highest was like a 0.52.
Okay. And how much of that would you associate to the way you eat versus supplementing?
Yes,
obviously, as a creator of Fatty 15, are you just keeping a bottle of that with you all day and popping one every few hours? Or I'm just curious how much diet versus supplementation weighs into that number.
Yeah.
And obviously you can only guess, but.
Right. So, and I agree. And this makes a really good point, which is the reason why we developed Fatty 15 and a pure C15 supplement just was to help truly be a supplement. Like, let's help be part of the solution. There are a lot of solutions here. The way that I'm getting to these longevity levels, I don't shy away from whole dairy fat, and specifically, I'm just a cheese lover. So Sardinians also have cheese that is particularly high in C15, in part because they're from sheep and goats that graze on mountainous grass. And all those combinations have shown that grass-eating ruminants at high altitudes produce the highest C15 in products there are. So they have this added benefit. So I do have cheese as a snack every day. That for sure helps boost my C15 levels, along with the supplementation. So that, I think, this is the combination of those two that gets me at this good targeted C15 level.
Let's get more into the food piece and talk about nuances there, because you're already starting to bring those in with the sheep and the goat, the fact that altitude matters. Let's bring in all the different variables when it comes to dairy, because this is our best source. And there are so many different pieces to this, and let's really take our time and go through it. There's the A1 versus A2 when it comes to cow. There's pasteurization, homogenization. Let's go right from the top and do a broad overview, and then we can get into some details.
That sounds good. So dairy fat is our primary source. And the first question I always get is like, okay, so if we created C15 deficiencies because we took dairy fat, we've been reducing our dairy fat intake over the past 40 to 60 years. We'll just go back to drinking milk, whole fat milk and eating whole fat cheese. And it's part of the solution. And I do fully believe that we need to get our kids back to having whole dairy fat for those kids that can tolerate it. Because in the 1990s, the pediatric recommendations changed. And it used to be where the recommendations since 1977 were for all Americans to decrease their intake of saturated fats. The primary way to do that is by eating less butter and drinking less whole fat milk. So then in the 1990s, the recommendations went even further for kids, where the recommendations were saying that children, really young children, should avoid or should move off of whole fat milk after they turn to the age of 2. And then for babies that are age 1, if they are at risk of fatty liver disease and type 2 diabetes, they're actually told to go off of whole fat milk by 1. So part of this, as far as food and fixing the problem, I do think that food can help fix some of the deficiency issues at the earliest ages. When we start looking at us as adults, there are advantages of getting C15 from our diet, but there also becomes a kind of a balance and challenge. And that is because if we look at milk fat, only 1% of milk fat has C15. Only 1% of milk fat is C15. Over 40% of milk fat are these pro-inflammatory, even chain saturated fatty acids. So C15 can do its job, but if you can imagine, it's like being in a room with a bunch of bullies and it's having to compete with pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory activities, which makes it harder to do its heavy lifting if we talk about the back half of maybe from the age 30 on. And so the reason why the Navy funded us to develop this supplement, this pure C15 supplement, is to say, can we get this pure ingredient that's bioavailable absent of the competing pro-inflammatory fats? And so there was a group that actually did a study, Jess, where they looked at a model of type 2 diabetes in mice, and we had given it pure C15. They gave it pure C17 and dairy fat. And what they showed was that we showed that C15, they got better. C17 was kind of meh. And when they gave the mice dairy fat, they got worse. So there's a complicated picture if we talk about what we're going to do over a long time. That said, I shared that I eat dairy fat. So when we talk about how we influence it in the food chain, a few key important points. The first is, like I mentioned, grass versus corn-fed. So animals that are fed grass have twice as much C15 in their fat than ones that are 100% corn-fed. We don't always know what's been fed when we're eating dairy products, so we don't actually know anymore how much C15 is in the milk fat we're eating. One thing that we're encouraging as part of this movement is having dairy producers report how much C15 is in their product, because I personally will choose the product that has more C15 in it. That's another way that we could help fix this problem. We also know that when we had talked about the mountainous grass, it doesn't appear that there's a difference based upon homogenization, surprisingly, or species. So if it's a goat, if it's a sheep or cow, it doesn't seem to matter. What's more important is what their diet is that dictates the C15 in their dairy fat. I've just been going on forever, so I'm going to pause.
No, this is great. This is what I wanted you to do. Thank you. The piece that I'm puzzled on, and you alluded to it quickly there as well, is the homogenization, where we're emulsifying the fat. So we're chemically changing things, and C15 is a saturated fat. So that one I'm perplexed on.
I am too. And I thought for sure we're going to see if you look at homogenization, pasteurization versus raw milk is going to have more C15 in it and result in higher C15. And that there was a group that actually looked specifically at that. And I surprisingly saw there was no difference between the two. So it might have to do with the stability of C15. It's a very stable molecule, and it could just be that it is just able to better withstand the challenges of homogenization and pasteurization.
Okay, so dairy's our top food. We know the dolphins were getting it from fatty fish. So let's talk about that as a food source. Different types of fish, how much we can actually get from fish, and then we'll get into other foods.
Sounds great. So for fish, there is C15 in fish, different types of fish. So for example, for the fish that we most often eat, salmon is probably the fish that has the highest amount of C15. So that's good news because I eat fish probably once a day. So big fish eater. So that might be another reason why my C15 levels are high. However, there is a caveat in which C15 is highest in the skin and the heads of the fish, which tends to be the parts of the fish that we don't eat, unless you eat anchovies, which you can end up eating the whole fish. So that's wild fish can provide some C15 compared to dairy fat, like studies that have looked at populations, fish intake, and their C15 levels. There's not a strong correlation. Versus when you say how much dairy fat does a person eat and what are their C15 levels, it's almost a perfect correlation if it was whole fat milk, for example.
When it comes to food or supplements, how long does it stay in the system? Is this something we need to have on a daily basis, weekly? Do we have some kind of reservoir where we can take days off of taking it in?
The answer is yes, but not for too long. And I'm not saying that because we sell supplements. So the studies have shown that we have two ways that we're using C15. So the first is where when we absorb C15, it goes into our blood and then it activates certain receptors, things like PPAR alpha delta. We talked about AMPK and AKT, which help with regard to the first with metabolism, controlling inflammation, the second being helping with insulin control and insulin and glucose control. So those go up and then they go down. And so their half-life when to trigger those receptors ends up being about 4 to 6 hours a day. So that comes and goes. So having ongoing exposure to C15 helps with activating those receptors. But then there's a longer term play, which is the one that we've been focusing on, which is C15 goes into our cell membranes. And it clearly doesn't just wash away after a few hours. Once it makes its way into our cell membranes, it'll stay there unless we dramatically change the fat in our diet. And amazingly, Jess, one study showed that in as early as 2 days, if you have an extreme shift, if you went from a very high fat diet to a very low fat diet, within 2 days, the makeup of our cell membranes and fatty acids reflects that change in your diet. So it can happen quite rapidly, but there are reserves, and it does go into our fat. It does get into our tissues, not just to our circulating red blood cells. So I would say non-scientifically, not pointing to any peer-reviewed study, which everything else I've said today points to a peer-reviewed study, that probably a week to 2 weeks before your cells and body would start feeling a decrease in that effects of the C15.
Early in the conversation, we talked about the seed oils, vegetable oils. Do we know whether or not our cells have an affinity for those fats versus C15? So if somebody is, and obviously we recommend avoiding those, the seed oils, but for somebody who is, living a more classic lifestyle and they're introducing those periodically, but now they become more cognizant of C15 and getting that in, I'm not worried, but I'm interested on competition between those if they're both coming in through diet or supplements.
Yeah, there's two parts of that story because it's a really interesting one. The first part is when we're eating C15, and again, not as a supplement, but as part of our diet, there is competition at the gut level. So ironically, studies have shown that when mice are fed a high fat diet, which includes C15, their C15 levels go down. And that is because it's having to compete with way more other fats because proportionately there's such of all that fat, so little bit C15 that again, it kind of gets bullied, not only from a pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, but even just getting absorbed through the gut. So there is competition unquestionably with other fats. with regard to when C15 is in our diet. So that is one reason to have a bioavailable free fatty acid form of C15, so it can bypass that competition. The second is then competition for who gets to be in the cell membrane. And the studies best support that the amount that gets into our cell membrane, the competition is really based upon what it is that you're eating. So your cell membrane really is going to reflect what you eat. So if you eat a lot of seed oils and have very little C15, that seed oil, those polyunsaturated fatty acids are going to outcompete C15. But C15 does seem to find its way, get its way through that. As long as it gets absorbed, then it's able to make its way into your cell membrane. But again, you made a really good point, which is our cell membranes truly are what we eat. And so if we change that's the good news is that we can positively affect our cell membranes in a relatively short period of time.
And I think you quickly touched on that before, where even within dairy, or a specific example you brought up, the C15 within that food was so low in the competition there. Okay, so that makes sense. And then given all that, if somebody's going to take a supplement of fatty 15, I would assume then you'd want to take it away from other fats.
Right. That's what we're just starting to learn, right? And so there have been 2 clinical trials with pure C15 supplementation. And one was with Jeff Schwimmer at the Rady Children's Hospital. And we didn't look specifically at what were they eating at the time. So we're learning more. And those competition studies were done in mice. And so we don't know for sure that that's how it plays out in humans. So it's a important question to be able to answer. But we encourage people to, we say that it's okay. Usually when you take a vitamin or a supplement, it's like, especially if that's a fat, it's like, take it with a meal, right? So that you get all the enzymes going and you can absorb it. Today we're saying it doesn't matter which way you take it, but it may end up becoming the flip, just what you're saying, which is like, it's better to take it on an empty stomach so that it doesn't have to compete with any. So those studies still need to be done. But yeah, we keep getting these surprises thanks to science. We're getting smarter and smarter.
Okay, coming back to the food, we've talked about dairy. We've gotten into fish. Any other significant sources that people are eating that contain it?
So there's an interesting story that goes with fiber. And that has to do with our microbiome. And so there have been, two really nice studies that have come out within this last year showing that by eating fiber, we can influence so the question is, when you eat fiber, you have a healthier liver, healthier metabolism. And so there was a group that wanted to dive in and understand why. And so what they got it down to was, a component of fiber called inulin, not insulin, but inulin in fiber is what helps lead to that benefit. So they dove even further and said, well, why inulin? And what they found was that inulin fed specific bacteria within our gut that then use inulin to make C15. And so at the end, they figured out that these liver health benefits and the metabolic benefits from fiber, which was giving the inulin, was because it was helping bacteria make C15, which in the end, it was the C15 that was causing the benefit. So that all leads back to there may be a role of fiber. So I eat whole grain as in I can see the grains. It's not a processed cracker, for example. And that may be one of the role that whole grain plays. But when you look at how much fiber you would have to eat, let's say to replace dairy as our source or a supplement, it kind of gets ridiculous at looking at how much inulin you need. It might be, again, part of a way to help boost our C15, but it's not strong enough to be our sole source of C15.
And one thing that jumps out at me as you explain that, for that to work, somebody needs to have the right bacteria in their gut. And a lot of us, due to the modern world, antibiotics, not feeding our gut microbiome, have done a lot of damage down there.
That's right.
which leads me to ask, do we know what specific species we want to have in the gut that we can feed the inulin to make the C15?
We're learning. My brain is not fed well enough right now to tell you the names. Usually I'm pretty good at this stuff, Jess, but I will send you for the show notes which bacteria. There are now 2 bacteria that have been identified, at least, that specifically produce C15. In addition, a clinical trial that was done in Singapore with C15 supplementation showed that people who use C15 supplementation, it actually helped to make a beneficial microbe called Bifidobacterium adolescentis. That doesn't make C15, but interestingly, C15 helps to Bifidobacterium adolescentis to grow, which is a really interesting microbe, not only because it helps with balancing metabolism, but that microbe in and of itself has helped to extend longevity in multiple species. So there's this kind of the gut, you can't get away from the gut health, right? It is so important. So it looks like there's a role where C15 helps good bacteria to grow, and we need the right bacteria there to be present to help to use foods to make more C15.
Interesting. And then again, coming back to what I had asked there about repopulating, well, what I said would lead to repopulating with those microbes that you're going to share with me and I'll put in the show notes. And then can we get those from certain fermented foods? Can we take certain probiotics to put those in? And then you've already mentioned the fact that this isn't going to be your biggest producer of C15, but to get that piece of the picture as well, along with, say, supplementing and diet.
Exactly. And then I'll add one more thing to it, because again, we can't get away from the gut. And all of these steps are, how can we maximize and get back to not only not being nutritionally deficient in C15, but then to get to those longevity enabling. And so it's a lot of things, right? And so it's being able to talk about all these. And the last thing I'll mention of studies that have shown with regard to how to maximize our C15 levels, exercise. So for all of us who aren't exercising and should, or are exercising and we get another reason to be that, and that's why I do that, is that exercise, people who exercise, this was specifically a study in pregnant women, showed pregnant women who exercised more had higher circulating C15 levels that then made it to their babies that had better growth and better brain development. And the hypothesis, which makes sense, is C15 is stored in our fat and in our tissues, and exercising helps release that C15 from our tissues and lets it go to work on our receptors and back into the circulation.
Okay, so this C15, I know it's just a hypothesis, but it's stored. Is this stored in different areas than like we've been talking about in the cell membranes?
It's stored in the cell membranes of many tissues. So probably all of our tissues have C15 stored in them. So, and the membranes are able to release that C15 upon activation of muscles and all of that good stuff.
Do you recall what kind of exercise they were doing? Was this resistance training, cardio?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't remember what their protocol was and which mix it was.
Any other adjuncts besides diet while we're on the exercise piece? Things that we can do lifestyle-wise to boost C15?
Yeah. Let's see. So exercise, fiber, because that's just yet another good reason to have fiber. Because we said every little edge that we can get is good. Grass-fed dairy products that are whole fat milk, but keeping in mind, we got to keep a balance of not over shocking our system with the pro-inflammatory saturated fats. Those right now, we're still learning. There's a paper that comes out on C15 now, Jess, about every 1 to 2 weeks. There's a new peer-reviewed paper on C15. So literally some of the things I'm telling you about now from one of them was from a paper that came out 2 days ago. So it's all at all peer-reviewed studies, by the way, we put at discoverc15.com. So that we try to keep up and put all of those studies there.
Okay, so we've gone over major ways of getting C15 through the diet. To recap, fiber, which is the least of the three, fish, fatty fish, and then dairy. But what about other animal products? And I already know that it's not found in plants, but I'll have you go over that. Contain C15. Like if we're having steak and eggs, like is there a little bit in all animal products? And then when it comes to plants, do any of them contain any?
Okay, so we'll start with meat. And if it's a ruminant, so which means if it is an animal that makes milk that we use, so that has a rumen, so it's a cow, a goat, a sheep that we've talked about, it's in their milk. It's also going to be in their meat. So it's going to be in the fat within their meat. And studies that have measured different amounts of C15 in these different food sources and different meat types have shown that, for example, Australian grass-fed lamb has the highest amount of C15 of any of the meats tested, quickly followed by Australian grass-fed beef. So we need to find out what's in that Australian grass that's helping their animals have a higher C15 levels. I will caveat meat, however, and I am a meat lover myself, but will caveat that similar to dairy, when you look at large scale studies of eating meat, especially from ruminants, and or drinking milk, there's not a consistent picture that this is good for our long-term health. I think we're learning that it's not always bad, but these benefits that we're seeing from C15 with regard to what we talked about in the beginning of stopping ferroptosis and being able to support our metabolic, immune, liver, and heart health, that isn't necessarily translated over just from the milk, and even more so on the meat side. So it can be a source, and I think it has to do with that competition. I think because we know that when we look at C15 content within meat, that bullying becomes even greater with other fats in the meat. So maybe that's why we don't see that clear picture. But yes, you can. There is C15 there.
And what about plants? Any and any plants?
Yeah. So plants, the highest content plant, which is going to sound contradictory to everything we just had shared by a table by the USDA where they tested a bunch of products. High oleic sunflower oil has C15 levels that are close to butter. But the question is, it's an oil and now it's mixed with all of these polyunsaturated fatty acids. Is it able to do the job that we need it to do? And there's one study that looked at a population of people who used sunflower oil a lot in their cooking, and it did not support that the added C15 they were getting from that food source was having any benefit to them at all. So, but I will share those data are out there. Other sources of plants, it's just really small amounts and not a great reliable source, with the exception of what we talked about is fiber helping our gut make more C15.
Right. It's interesting though, because we know the type of grass has such an impact on how much the animal will have, but yet we can't get a significant source from plants themselves. So just interesting.
The magic is the rumen. And so the ruminants have this wonderful factory in which they have their own special set of microbes. You're getting to the veterinarian in me, but their own special set of microbes that in which the cows and the ruminants that eat these fibers and plants all the time, they have found really efficient ways to be able to, with the bacteria that they have in far higher amounts than us, are able to make C15 in a very efficient way. We do it in like a really weak way, but we just haven't evolved the same way, our digestive tracts the same way as cows, sheep, and goats. And so we just aren't able to make as much use of grasses and plants of making C15 out of them.
Good news for vegetarians, the number one source is dairy, and most of them will include that within their diet. But vegans, on the other hand, it sounds like they're getting none or very little. Do we have any data on their cells and their cell membranes and how fragile those are? And is there anything, we know exercise, but that comes from our stores in the body. And if we're not taking that in initially, I wouldn't assume they would have stores to, release through exercising. So basically, what do we do about vegans?
Right. So another reason for having a vegan friendly, making our supplement vegan friendly, was for that purpose. It is, nobody has zero C15. And I think that goes back to the fact that the microbes in our gut have some capability of making C15. So that makes sure that nobody has zero. But the problem is just what you're talking about and getting to is that we have more people who are sitting right at that threshold or below of the handful of people that we know that are vegans who use the test and were kind enough to share their data with us. We said, again, the minimum we need to get above 0.2%. They're more in the 0.06, 0.04%. So strongly deficient. I think we get more of a hint with regard to understanding that the higher the C15, the lower the risk of developing chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and heart disease, that it will be looking out at this new generation. The big question that we have right now is we have 30-year-olds, regardless of whether they're vegan or not, we know that they're getting less C15 than the generations before them because they're drinking oat milk and plant-based milks and which have no C15 in them. That we have this cohort of 30-somethings that are developing heart disease, coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, multiple different types of cancers. They're developing aging-associated diseases like 30 years earlier than they should. And so I think that feeds more into the question of what happens when you don't have enough C15 and you're developing this C15 deficiency syndrome. What is that putting us at risk of? And so vegans will be in that category, but I think it's even more. It's just that if moms have less C15, their babies get less C15, and you have babies born in the 1990s who really were brought into a relatively C15 deficient world. So that's really where a focus of a lot of our efforts are saying, hey, can we be part of the solution through, how do we get appropriate dairy fat back into people's lives? How do we make that dairy fat? How can we find out how much C15 is in it? Can we revisit nutritional guidelines regarding saturated fats, especially for kids? And then can we have the supplement be part of the solution, especially for people who are avoiding dairy fats? And then as we get older, our C15 levels just go down. And how can we get to that? Not only keep the levels that we need, but how can we get above and beyond into those longevity enabling levels?
I know C15, a lot of this research, like you just said, is coming out all the time. It's really new. But when was the molecule first discovered?
1954. So it was first found. So it's been known for quite a while. The first essential fatty acids, linoleic acid and alpha linolenic acid, and omega-6 and omega-3, those were discovered in 1929 and 1931. So it took a couple decades before we even knew that C15 existed. Because it's present at such low levels, and because it was a saturated fat, it's really it was kind of tossed to the side as far as it's certainly not important. And if anything, we should take less of it. So it took the dolphins to be able to see that not all saturated fats are created equal, and that C15 was beneficial. And it ends up at the same time we made that discovery in dolphins, there were dozens and dozens of studies that were starting to pour out showing that the same picture in people. People with higher C15 had a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease. But our blinders were up, Jesse, as far as what that meant when those papers were coming out. Because they were saying higher C16 and C18 are bad for us. So they're like, aha, just as we thought. And then they had this like tiny little caveat on the bottom saying, oh, and by the way, these like trace odd chain saturated fats, C15, C17, were like associated with better health, but that's just not important. So it really took the dolphins to help make that a very clean and clear picture without any blinders, because all they eat are fish. We weren't worried that they were on a bad diet. And then it just kind of opened up the whole world to seeing how essential C15 is.
Okay, so 1950s discovered. I'm just trying to piece the timeline together. Was it 2012 that you and your team, I guess, or I'm assuming you're with the team, discovered the benefits of it in dolphins?
So 2015, that's when we first discovered that. So 2012, we discovered something's up with the dolphins, that there's this syndrome, and they have this iron overload, and they have anemia, and they have just basically this whole package of C15 deficiency or cellular fragility syndrome. We just didn't know what caused it.
Got it. I knew there was something with that year. And then it was 2015. Continue, sorry.
And then Office of Naval Research said, so we did research, early research started in 2008, saying, hey, let's understand aging in dolphins. So in those 4 years, we're like, oh, hey, there are some dolphins that have this like weird disease and phenotype that we can't explain. So they said, great, we'll give you funding to figure out what's causing that. So it was that funding that then enabled us to narrow down C15 as the top predictor of dolphins that did not have that accelerated aging phenotype.
And since I brought up team, how many people are you working with?
Oh my goodness. Well, the Navy Marine Mammal Program as a whole is huge. So it's, there for that group, there were, 150 plus people. For our team that was working on that, a humble group of maybe 3 or 4 of us that were, literally in classified double locked rooms, just clickety clacketing, crunching data. So anyway, but the whole team supported, let's give dolphins a higher C15 diet and see what happens with that. So it was really the whole group that helped to kind of sleuth this problem.
All right, where I was trying to go with all this, coming back to the vegan piece, when something like this happens and we realize there's a new molecule, which again, it's been around since the 50s, but we're realizing the benefits as of late. It gets me thinking of other things that a diet like that could be missing. If we're coming up with stuff like this, who knows how many other things will be discovered in the upcoming years. So I just want to point out that to me, when something like this happens, it's an important milestone, we'll call it, to check in for people that are having diets that are on the extremes and maybe missing things that aren't even discovered yet.
That is exactly right. And a big thing we're pushing is we have all of these advanced technologies, which used to be really expensive and cost prohibitive, right, for anyone but pharma companies to be using. But these technologies now, like metabolomics, all the omics technologies, are so much more accessible now, and that we need to increasingly apply the advances in these technologies that were really meant initially for pharmaceutical companies, and let's apply them to nutrition. And that's what allowed us is to use this technology and screening assays that were traditionally used for drug development and testing. We did that with nutrients. And that just unlocked so much discovery that enabled. So absolutely, Jesse, I completely agree with you. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's no way we are done finding essential nutrients. I think there's going to be a whole new group of essential vitamins and amino acids and fatty acids that we're going to discover. So it is a very exciting time at a time that we kind of hit this wall with pharmaceuticals where we have too many diseases that don't have cures. Where now I feel like we have this really hopeful period of studies and science and research. And even better, we get to do this while caring for our fellow animal species, which is, it doesn't get better than that.
So coming back to our 0.2 number of C15, that is that threshold where problems occur if you're below that. You mentioned something along the lines that the average person is right around that number. So it sounds like to me there's good news within this, because if that's the case, with a little bit of awareness or including a supplement like you've created, we can easily get people up. And then why this is a good place to talk about this is because the whole vegan piece, if they're part of the population as a whole, which they are, they have way lower. So that might mean the person that's having a mixed diet, the average person is beyond that point too.
That's right.
So a lot of different pieces there, but good news. Essentially what I'm saying here is good news that we're at least hovering that number. But obviously, like we talked about before, there's a lot of room for improvement. People like you that are hitting much higher numbers.
Yeah, and we're close. I mean, goodness gracious, if industrial London can fix kids who had bowed legs because of vitamin D deficiency, and they figured out by giving them cod liver oil, they fixed the problem. And pirates with scurvy is like, oh, put limes and oranges on the ships. It's like you can fix the problem. And so, like you're saying, there is so much hope here that we are close, that this is not something that, is going to take decades and decades to figure out. It took decades to find for all of this to happen. But now that we're here, it's almost like we just can't afford to wait, given all of the science that we have, the safety of this ingredient, of figuring out all these different ways, exercise and increasing our fiber and having the right microbiota and feeding our ruminants the right way and reporting C15 levels and having a supplement, that all of those things can help get us back on track.
So we've gotten into the bad polyunsaturated fats, the seed oils. I want to bring the good guys in now, our ALA, DHA, EPA. How do those mesh with C15? Is there any competition issues there? Do they work well together? Let's bring them in.
Yeah, I see those, the essential omegas and C15 as a yin and yang for your cells. So your cell membranes need to be flexible, and that's where these essential fatty acids come in. So EPA, and technically EPA and DHA are not essential fatty acids, but they're important metabolites of the essential fatty acids. So we're just going to put them all in the same group. That they play an important role. DHA, especially with regard to neurologic health and brain development, and EPA with regard to anti-inflammatory and heart protection. So it's almost like saying, hey, we knew about vitamin A, B, and C, and we discovered vitamin D. We wouldn't say you don't need vitamin A anymore, right? So these are all complementary to each other. Where our challenge that we're posing to the world is that because omega-3s are polyunsaturated fatty acids, and they do have double bonds and they are susceptible to lipid peroxidation, that it is clear that getting our omega-3s from fish is beneficial. So people who eat fish have a lower risk of heart disease, while fish has a lot of things, including some C15, is primarily probably those omega-3s that are providing that heart protective effect. When you give pure EPA to like Vascepa as a drug, it also works well in reducing the risk and protecting our heart health, reducing the risk of heart disease and protecting heart health. The tricky part comes in is when it's fish oil in a supplement. And that's because, again, it's not the manufacturer's fault. It's just that these molecules are fragile. And when they get exposed to oxygen, they break down in our cells, but they also break down in the bottle, which leads to rancidity and lipid peroxidation. When that happens, then the supplements aren't efficacious. So there are now large-scale studies when they specifically look at omega-3 supplements, not the pure drug and not fish, but but omega-3 fish oil supplements, that they aren't efficacious in protecting against heart disease and a lot of the other benefits. NIH themselves have put out that summary with regard to it. So I think the challenge is, how can we increase the purity of these omega-3s so that we can put them to work, and or make sure that we get adequate levels from our diet. So it kind of plays an opposite role of C15 with regard to food is a great source for omega-3s. And so I'm not an omega-3 basher in any way. They need to come together. It's just trying to solve the problem around the susceptibility of these molecules to oxygen.
And for completeness, we have to bring the omega-6s in as well, which are essential. They're pro-inflammatory, but they're part of the picture and they are essential.
That's right. Fats are not, you can't just put fats in one big category. Certainly have learned that even when omega-3 and omega-6, right, those two were first discovered as essential fatty acids back in 1929 and 1931, it was mind-blowing because back then the belief was that fats were nothing but an energy source and that they provided no benefits whatsoever. So we're continuing to learn. It's, 100 years later, and we're still like, oh, not all saturated fats are bad. And in fact, one of them is essential. So that we'll just continue to learn, Jess, and hopefully we can adapt our diets appropriately. I think the big thing is just don't go extreme in any one direction, and do the best that we can to maintain a healthy food supply that's coming in on our shelves.
So to recap here, C15 we can get through supplement, through diet, through the gut bacteria if we have the right ones, and inulin. We also store it in the cell membranes, and there is storage in the tissues as well that can be released throughout the body. Does the body make any within itself? Specifically, endogenous creation of C15 without the other things we've talked about, like gut bacteria or just re-releasing?
It may, but in amounts that are not meaningful in any way. So interestingly, we know that because when you read these early studies about the advantages of odd chain saturated fatty acids, it's always C15, C17, higher levels of these two, better health. Interestingly, our bodies use C15 to make C17. So we can make odd chain fatty acids, but it does again seem like, and we can take C15 and we can degrade it. We can metabolize it by two, it'll break down by two carbons. And so C15 helps us make the shorter chain fatty acids, which like propionic acid, which has remarkable benefits of C3. So C15 is like the Goldilocks, so we've got to get that into our bodies. We can elongate it to make a C17, which does have some of its own benefits. It's kind of like the little sibling that doesn't quite live up to the older siblings' wonderfulness, but it's still there. And then the shorter chain propionic, it can break down. So that's what it's supporting, that endogenous production outside of the microbiome is really minimal and does not provide meaningful amounts.
Okay, just so I'm crystal clear though, we can't make C15 specifically. We can just use that to make other fats.
That's right. And there will be somebody, if they're super savvy, and they'll find a paper to say like, oh, I saw a paper where C13 went to C17. It's possible. It's just the mechanisms aren't efficient enough in our bodies to enable us to have even close to adequate amounts on their own.
For somebody who's tuned in today and they're going to start upping their C15, making their cells healthier, any other supplements out there that can complement cell membranes and C15, something that can work in synergy well with C15 supplement-wise?
It's a good question. So for cell membranes, as far as the complementary cell, the ability for the cell to be flexible, that's not going to be via supplements. So it'll be via food for the omegas. For the cell membrane, it's really limited. C15 is kind of it right now. However, for the cell, because we're just talking about the walls of the house, right? And so there are wonderful supplements out there that can do some impressive heavy lifting to complement the role of, especially when we look at these hallmarks of aging. And so I do think that some of the mitochondrial repairing and supporting supplements, urolithin A, supplements, I think that those have great science behind them of showing mitochondrial support. C15 also helps repair mitochondrial function as well. And so I think that they could have complementary benefits, especially with regard to muscle for those. But really, it's a personal journey for every person and we always say, talk with your physician. It's what conditions do you have? What medications are you on? And what supplements can help complement what you need and meet your needs. Unfortunately, a lot of physicians are kind of asking the same questions too, but there is a growing cohort of physicians who really are owning the supplement space and are getting super savvy with regard to that. On the flip side, we have not seen any contraindications. So if you're taking fatty 15, don't take this, or C15 supplement, don't take this. We have seen nothing to that, nothing along those lines.
Okay, so we've gone over in the body testing what we want to look for, the threshold, what we want to aim for optimum. But how much C15 are in these top foods we've talked about versus supplements?
Right. So
just trying to put together an idea for people what an ideal day would look like, how much they need to get through different things, food and supplements, to have an optimal level in the body.
Yeah. Okay. So to not be deficient, we need an added 100 to 200 milligrams of C15 per day. And we know for sure that in the free fatty acid form. So, because multiple studies have been done on that, including the latest clinical trial that Jeff Schwimmer led. It's probably about the same for food. So, food-based C15, 100 to 300 milligrams. For every 100 milligrams of C15 that we absorb, our C15 levels go up by around 0.1%. So that means that if you are right on that threshold of 0.2%, then just by getting an extra 100 to 200 milligrams per day, that can get you in a really off the cliff and more into that 0.3, heading toward a 0.4%. So milk, whole fat milk, 1 cup has 100 milligrams of C15 in it. So that gets to the question of well, why don't I just drink 1 to 2 cups of whole fat milk and I'm good to go? But what we're seeing is because of the competitive absorption of it, it's harder for people to, on an ongoing basis, continue to maintain for that to be an adequate amount. So we're kind of caught a little bit at the studies that have been done are on the pure free fatty acid bioavailable C15 levels versus the dietary levels. So we're kind of having to bring the science from the two together to say, get 1 to 2 servings of whole dairy fat per day, because you don't want to get too much, and then to be able to then supplement as appropriate with the C15 supplementation. The test is helpful because it provides a guide, but I will say that we have of our customers that 50% report feeling better within 2 weeks, and just by taking 1 capsule, 100 milligrams a day. And so that does support that amount, seems to get most people where they need to go. At the most, they go up to 2 capsules a day to then start seeing those benefits with regard to the ones that the doctors care about.
Coming back to our classical insulin resistance, where somebody's having too many carbs, too many sugars, blood glucose is going up, the body over time is making more insulin to jam that into cells. I would love to see a study where somebody is eating that mixed diet and then we introduce C15 on top of that. Because right now in the low carb keto world, the guidance would be, okay, let's lower the carbs and let that correct itself over time. I, at this point, feel that's the best method for reversal until coming across your work. But now I'm curious, can we use C15 on top of that to speed that process up? Or I wouldn't want somebody to do this testing because they would be putting themselves through eating too many carbs and insulin resistance or diabetes. But it would be interesting as a thought experiment if they continue to eat that diet that had substantial amount of carbs and just put C15 in to see if insulin resistance would reverse just with that. So different variables there, but because this is coming into a paradigm of insulin resistance and reversal being so well established, I'd love to work this in and see how they can complement each other and work together.
Right. So it's not nothing is ever a magic pill. So it's not like do everything you're doing, just take this pill and it's all fixed, right? So so there are two ways to look at the diet component. The first is the studies that are done in relevant models. Those models of type 2 diabetes, of fatty liver disease, continue to be given what they call a Western high-fat diet that induces the disease state. They continue to be on that diet when they're given C15 and that they improve. So it's not like it says, okay, now I want you on your wheel 20 minutes a day. And so it's just the only thing they change. The bad diet stays the same. C15 is added. And that's it was a remarkable lift to say, hey, this model is given a high fat diet that then induces diabetes and fatty liver disease. So we're going to treat that with a saturated fat. I mean, what? And it worked. So it does suggest that there is that component. In a human clinical trial in Singapore, they did the opposite, Jesse. So they actually did where they took people and they put them on a low calorie diet. So that was group one. The second, and these were women with fatty liver disease. The second group, they put them on a low calorie diet that followed Mediterranean diet guidelines. And then the third group was low calorie diet, Mediterranean guidelines, and C15 supplementation. And that's a heavy lift because you're like, just by losing weight, by eating less calories, losing weight, being on an incredible diet that's been well shown to improve health of the Mediterranean diet, what is C15 going to do above and beyond that? And that study showed that C15 supplementation had a significant impact on lowering LDL cholesterol and increasing that microbe. That's where the increased growth of Bifidobacterium adolescentis benefits above and beyond. And when you looked at a trend level, not a p-value, but a trend level, that third group had the greatest loss of body fat and the greatest loss of liver fat. So they kind of flipped that question and said, what if you did everything that we're supposed to do to maximize our health, and then you added C15 on top of it?
Okay. The study I'm looking for is low carb
right.
and putting C15 in, comparing that to low carb and seeing how quickly we can reverse insulin resistance, having this as an adjunct on top of that model that we've already tested and seen work.
That's right. And one could argue that the lower calorie Mediterranean diet could have been a lower carb diet. We'd have to look at the details of the diet makeup. And this was a 12-week study, and we didn't see above and beyond improvement. They all got better just by eating less, going Mediterranean diet, and C15. All three groups got better, but that C15 group didn't necessarily, again, within 12 weeks at that dose, did not have better. It didn't happen with better within a 12-week period. So it's trying to figure out, again, where C15 lives and best works. And again, that was specific to women with fatty liver disease as well.
Well, by the sounds of it, research is going to continue at a high rate, and a lot of this data is going to continue to come out over the upcoming years. So exciting to follow. And I just want to thank you, Steph, for the work you're doing, coming on the show and sharing this. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, Jesse, it's been a pleasure being here. And yeah, just so excited, so glad that the world is working on it. And we definitely are at the point where the science, there's so much science now, we just can't explain C15 away anymore. And so are very excited that we're not alone anymore. The world's working on the problem.
Well, we're going to link everything up in the show notes, including Fatty 15. And thanks again.
Great. Thank you, Jess.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
Ultimately, it's not what's in the food, it's what's been done to the food that matters. Everything fructose does to the mitochondria is designed to inhibit its functioning. It's metabolic health that drives